Welcome to the Lives Beneath History. Basitu stands barefoot on a wind-scoured hillside, the smell of sheep and dust clinging to her as she squints toward a distant river she cannot yet see. She lives in the shadow of ancient Babylon, in an age when wool, silver, and the favor of Marduk shaped the course of ordinary lives. 19 years old and restless, she measures her world not only in sheep and seasons, but in weighed silver and the promise of the city's markets. This is her story. The pile of dung squelched under the shepherd's bare foot and pressed up between her toes. The heat had softened it. Basitu jerked her foot back with a hiss of disgust and wiped it hard against a patch of dry grass that bent and broke beneath her heel. The smell rose immediately, thick and sour in the still air. She cursed under her breath, using the same blunt words her father and brothers used when a lamb wandered off or a water skin split open at the seam. She cursed the dung. She cursed the sheep that had dropped it. She cursed that sheep's sire and the sires before him. She cursed the idea of sheep entirely, and the hard ground beneath them, and the long sun that hung overhead without mercy. Most of all, she cursed that she, Basitu, 19 years old and quick with numbers, was standing on this scrubby hillside at the edge of the desert instead of anywhere else. The wind moved across the slope in slow gusts, carrying dust and the dry rattle of seed heads. The sheep spread out in a loose arc below her, noses down, tearing at the thin grass that clung to the soil between patches of bare earth. Their backs were already yellowed with dust. A few lambs bleated as they jostled for space near their mothers. Basitu adjusted the leather strap that held her water skin across her shoulder and scanned the flock, counting without meaning to. 48 ewes, 6 rams, 12 lambs born late in the season. She knew the number as surely as she knew the lines in her own palm. Her father trusted her with the flock because she noticed things. She noticed which ewe favored one leg. She noticed when a ram grew restless and started pushing at the others. She noticed when the grass was grazed too close, and it was time to move on. But noticing did not make her love it. The hillside sloped down toward a dry wadi where, in the spring, water sometimes ran for a few days before disappearing again. Now it was only cracked mud and scattered stones. Beyond it lay more land like this, stretching toward the faint shimmer where the desert began in earnest. Somewhere to the west, the great river flowed, broad and brown and busy with boats. She could not see it from here, but she felt its pull as if it were a cord tied round her waist. Babylon lay along that river, not so far if one traveled by boat and had the coin to pay for passage. Basitu had been there 3 times. 3 times was enough to know that this hillside was not the whole world. She remembered the first journey clearly. She had been 16 and still short enough that her father had walked slightly ahead in the crowded streets, glancing back to make sure she did not disappear between carts and donkeys. The city had risen before them in sun-baked brick and bright glazed tiles. The temples had seemed to scrape the sky. She had stared at the towering structure dedicated to Marduk, its terraces climbing one above another, priests moving along its steps like ants. Her father had spoken in a low voice about the god's power, about the dragon Mushusuf carved and painted along the walls, about the need to show respect. Basitu had looked, but her attention had drifted to the movement at the base of the temple complex, where vendors called out prices and silver clinked from hand to hand. She had never heard that sound so often in one place. It was sharper than copper, heavier when it struck a wooden counter. It meant weight. It meant choice. They had gone to meet her aunt's new husband, a wool merchant with a trimmed beard and clean linen wrapped tightly round his waist. He had spoken quickly, eyes bright, explaining how wool from the countryside could be washed, combed, spun, and woven in the city for a good return. He had offered to buy their entire year's supply for silver. Real silver, weighed and measured before witnesses. When the merchant named his price, she had felt her breath catch. It was many times what her eldest brother had earned for a month's labor digging a canal under the overseer's watch. She remembered that month well. Her brother had returned with blistered hands and a small leather pouch. He had poured the contents into their father's palm. A few pieces of silver, irregular but heavy, each stamped to show its weight. The family had passed them from hand to hand before storing them carefully. In Babylon, silver seemed to move like water. Basitu had asked questions wherever she went. How much for a jar of oil? How much for a length of dyed cloth? How much for a basket of dates? The vendors had looked at her with surprise at first, then amusement, then mild respect when they realized she could follow their answers without confusion. She had begun to build a measure in her mind. On their second visit, she had done most of the reckoning herself. Her uncle had smiled too widely when he weighed out the payment. Basitu had stepped closer and watched the scale. One stone sat slightly off-center. She had pointed it out. Her uncle had laughed and adjusted it without argument, claiming the shift had been accidental. Basitu had not answered. Whether mistake or test, she had seen it. On this hillside, with dung clinging to her heel, she remembered the cool shade of the market awnings. She remembered the smell of bread stuffed with mutton and dates, spiced and baked until the crust cracked when torn. She remembered men speaking in accents from Syria, traders from Elam with different styles of dress and different cuts of beard. She bent to pick a burr from the fleece of a ewe that brushed past her. The wool was coarse with dust and bits of thorn. It would need washing in large vats, beating against stones, combing with iron teeth before it could be spun. She knew the process from watching women in the village work through long afternoons. Her aunt had described how in the city there were workshops where dozens of women spun at once, their hands moving constantly, overseen by scribes who recorded the output on clay tablets. Tablets meant contracts. Contracts meant payment in measured silver, not in promises or barter. A lamb had strayed toward the wadi. She clicked her tongue sharply and whistled. The lamb lifted its head and hesitated. Basitu picked up her stick and walked briskly downhill. The lamb reached the edge of the wadi and began to pick its way down the cracked slope. Basitu moved faster, sliding slightly on loose gravel. She caught the animal by the scruff of its neck before it could stumble into a deeper crevice. She thought of the day she had taken her first small piece of silver to Marduk's temple. She had held it tightly in her fist, feeling its cool weight. The temple courtyard had been crowded. Incense smoke had drifted in slow curls. She had stepped forward and placed the silver among other offerings. She had simply asked that the gods see her. A sudden shout carried from the far side of the slope. Her younger brother approached with flatbread and dried dates. After he left, Basitu sat on a flat stone and ate, calculating wool yields and imagining honest scales in a shop of her own. The afternoon wore on. The sheep settled. She walked the perimeter, dust clinging to her legs. As the light softened, she gathered the flock and guided them home. In the distance, a faint haze marked the direction of the river, and, beyond it, Babylon. She fixed the direction in her mind once more and tightened her grip on the stick, urging the flock forward across the uneven ground. Basitu's name was never pressed into wet clay by royal scribes, nor carved into the walls of a temple. The great chronicles speak of kings, of conquests, of towering gates and gods born in procession. Yet beyond those grand accounts stood young women like her, counting flocks beneath a wide and indifferent sky, quietly measuring the worth of their labor in silver and hope. The strength of cities rested on such hands, steady and uncelebrated. History remembers its monuments. It rarely remembers the shepherd who dreamed beyond them. But it was in lives like hers that the foundations of Babylon endured. Thank you for listening to the Lives Beneath History.